Professor Michelle Watt, Dr. Claire Farrell, and Professor Stefan Arndt, who will bring each of their unique research and personal perspectives to tonight's conversations. And I'm also very pleased that we have Kirsten Parris, Professor of Urban Ecology from the School of Ecosystem and Forestry Sciences, to moderate this evening's discussion. Kirsten is a truly accomplished academic in all flavours of academia. She is also an honorary associate of the Royal Botanic Gardens of Victoria and the convener of the Science Communication Research Chapter of the Ecological Society of Australia. She has a deep affinity with frogs. Her research spans urban ecology, amphibian ecology, conservation biology, animal behaviour, field survey methods, and ecological methods. She is an excellent science communicator and accomplished researcher, and I know that you are in very good hands tonight. Over to you, Kirsten.
Thank you, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here this evening moderating this panel discussion, and my pleasure to be with three amazing plant scientists. Just as a little introduction to me, before I was a frog person, I was a plant person. You have to go back in the day. Pauline, one of my honours supervisors, is in the front row. So I did my honours in paleobotany in the systematics lab in the School of Botany on the Parkville campus before turning my attention to frogs, but also their amazing habitats in subtropical forests in Queensland and northern New South Wales. And plants are the beginning, the middle and the end, really, of our life on Earth. Without plants, we wouldn't have air to breathe, we wouldn't have food to eat, we wouldn't have fibres for our clothing, timber for our buildings, and we wouldn't have the amazing, beautiful, diverse range of species that bring us so much joy and so much satisfaction in our lives. So it's all going to be about plants tonight, and I'm really pleased that you're here with us for the journey. I'll start by introducing my panel and then asking them a short question about how they came to be where they are in their career. And it's my pleasure to start with Professor Michelle Watt. Michelle is the Adrian Clark Professorial Chair of Botany in the School of Biosciences, based at the Parkville campus of the University of Melbourne. And Michelle knows a lot about plants, but particularly focuses her research on plant root systems, the parts underground that may be a little bit out of sight, but not out of mind, and incredibly important for clearly the persistence of plants, but also for all the other species that depend upon them. So, Michelle, can you tell me why you love plants so much?
Yeah, sure. I think this question, it was going to be, how did you get into plants? And I said, well, I think I'll answer, why did I stay so long in plants? Because that goes to the heart of something a bit mysterious, I think. I've traveled around the world to study plants, starting in Canada, then Australia, Germany, and back to Australia. And I guess, had options for studying other things, started in economics. And I guess the thing that, it's a bit mysterious, really. And I think that's the mysterious thing about plants, is that we've taken them for granted. They're around us, they're ubiquitous, they're literally part of the furniture, and yet there's so much to discover about them. And I think the thing that probably, interests me the most about them is their ability to adapt to so many different environments. The cells of plants are completely different to the cells of animals, and they are regenerative, and they also can synthesize all their own energy from the sun. And I guess it's the mystery of these adaptations in these cells that keeps me so interested in them. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle. Next in line, we have Professor Stefan Arndt, who is Professor of Physiological and Ecosystem Ecology, based here in the School of Ecosystem Sciences at the Burnley Campus. And Stefan is an ecologist with 20 years' experience studying ecological systems, and much of his work centres around how plants cope with environmental change. So, Stefan, tell me how you came to be in plants.
Yeah, so my attachment to plants was a bit accidental, I have to say. I had to pick a topic for my master's studies at the University of Münster in Germany, and do you go zoology, do you go genetics, do you go plants? I happened to be in the same faculty executive as the professor that I didn't choose, and the reason that I chose her is that she wouldn't sit with the other professors. She would sit with us students there and sometimes make disparaging remarks about her colleagues. And so that was really attractive at that point to me. Today, of course, I would look at this differently. And so I studied with her, and this led me to work in Zimbabwe and in India. And the topic of my PhD was how does a specific tree species adapt to drought? And what was really fascinating is figuring out that there were so many different mechanisms how this tree actually were able to cope with drought. And a key moment for me was during a postdoc that I did in the Taklamakan Desert in Xinjiang in Western China. Well, we drove along the freeway or the highway there, and all of a sudden there's this singular plant, Populus euphatica, standing there in the middle of the desert. So you can think about a Saharan desert, sand dunes left and right, and all of a sudden there's a single tree. And you go, why is it there? How does it do it? It's a desert. It rains 30 millimeters a year. How can this species survive? So we studied that, and we figured out it could do it because it has deep roots, goes into saline groundwater, and it can exclude the salt from the groundwater, put some of the salt that comes up into its leaves, and of course it's deciduous, so it drops its leaves. So it's perfectly adapted to the environment, and that really interested me, is how are plants doing this? How can they adjust or adapt to the environment in which they grow? And I've been studying ever since.
Thanks, Stefan. And third, on my far right, is Dr. Claire Farrell, who's a senior lecturer in green infrastructure, again here based at the Burnley Campus in the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences. And Claire has amazingly diverse interests within the broad frame of green infrastructure. She knows about green roofs and walls, but also has been leading the Woody Meadow project, which has been looking at biodiverse woody plantings and how they can be used to provide pleasing landscapes, but also a range of other services in the urban environment. And Claire is interested in natural ecosystems as templates to design more constructed green landscapes. So Claire, tell me how you got into plants.
Yeah, I really love this question. And it's quite funny because my high school teacher hated plants with a passion. And so every biology lesson, humans, zoology, totally over it, engaging, wonderful teacher. She was a wonderful teacher, but hated plants. So the pracs were dull, the content was dull, it was reading the textbook, and so you wonder how I got here. So luckily for me, it was the time of David Attenborough and The Private Life of Plants. And so it just brought to life all these dull textbook concepts of transportation of water through plants and the fact that plants could live in the dark or adapt to the desert and all of these other things. And so that really got me across the line. But of course, I had parents, like most parents, who were really concerned that studying plants at university wouldn't lead to a career. And so I was on a path to do dentistry. And It's an interesting one, isn't it? But, but luckily for me, that pathway didn't happen because at that time you had to do dentistry prereqs. You could be in any degree and you just had to do prereqs and then apply to get into dentistry. And I failed physics for dentistry. So that was the end of that. And at the same time, I was doing first year botany and I just had the most wonderful lecturers, and I still to this day remember a pineapple being hurled through the lecture theatre to teach us about pineapples and multiple fruits and all of these things. And then the rest is history.
Wow, I don't think I ever saw anyone throw a pineapple. That must be a Queensland thing. Fantastic. So, Michelle, let's go way back to the beginning, to the origin of plants and how this is significant to the planet and to us.
Yeah, so, I mean, plants started as a beautiful symbiosis, a beautiful coming together of a host cell that took on what became a mitochondrial organelle, so another bacterium that was able to use the oxygen in the atmosphere as an electron acceptor. And the third part of this beautiful symbiosis was another bacterium came along, which became a chloroplast, which has all the machinery to convert sunlight into a split water molecule that makes that electron that goes to that oxygen molecule. So we started with a cell, and this happened in water originally, that was the beginning of having our only organisms on Earth, really, that can make their own energy and convert that energy into now many, many different molecules through many biochemical pathways. And it's all those biochemical pathways in plants that give us our food, give us the wood, furniture around us, new medicines, you name it now, because now with sophisticated biology, we can use plants as biofactories. And I guess the other interesting thing about the origin of plants is the first plants that came onto land, actually, their first root systems were actually fungi. So this was another symbiosis that was another organism that formed the first beginnings of a network of attachment to soil for taking up water and nutrients. And of course, we had evolution of all the different sorts of species that we've already heard about from Anne and Claire. And so I guess the thing that fascinates me about plants, why are plants so special? I think what we still don't understand is the psychological benefits that we get from plants. And we've become very, very technologically proficient at getting plants to work for us and including into the future. But to solve this mystery of why it is that this human plant or even animal plant symbioses also involved, I think to me that's kind of a future discovery. Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks, Michelle. So Claire, would you like to share some thoughts on how our relationship with plants has changed over time, not just here in Australia, but all around the world?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. And from a Western perspective, our history with plants has been about colonising and showcasing status and wealth. And I mean, one of the most amazing things of being a plant scientist, but merging it with horticulture in a place like Burnley, is you get exposed to that history of gardening and where gardens came through time and what was important about them. And a lot of the time, they're about showcasing wealth and conquering nature. Saying, I can keep the jungle away or I can keep the wilderness at bay, have everything in neat rows and take what I want from nature and own it. And I think that's something that we can see changing with how we respond and use plants now. You know, we can see cities are transforming where plants are coming into the built fabric, and we're celebrating their wildness again, which is a really wonderful thing. And if we go back to pineapples, you know, we think about pineapples. People didn't eat pineapples in the old days. They used to just put them on a table and celebrate the wealth that they had to buy that pineapple and have it there. So, you know, we have had that very conquering, controlling nature of our relationship with plants. And I think one of the biggest drawbacks of that is the loss of knowledge that that process ensured, because, you know, all of the names of plants that existed before they were conquered and renamed by someone else did mean something about how those plants were used, or how they were important spiritually or culturally, or what they might have done for the culture that they were in. And so that's something I feel that we're missing from that process. And I really welcome the change now to bring First Nations back into the conversations about plants and how we use them for that reason.
Thanks, Claire. And you all on the panel and some of you in the audience may have had the opportunity to see the Emu Sky exhibition that was on at the Old Quad Gallery at Parkville, curated by Zena Cumpston, who's an amazing Indigenous researcher, featuring all sorts of works highlighting Indigenous knowledge of plants and their uses over hundreds, even thousands of generations. And it was an amazing experience. I've still got this plant tapping me on the shoulder. And Zena and two co-authors, Michael Sean Fletcher and Leslie Head, have recently just published a book about Indigenous plant knowledge. So look out for that, just a little plug. Awesome. So, Stefan, how do you think, looking a little bit forward now, how do you think we can use what we know of plants to help us manage a changing climate? And to what extent can plants save us from climate change? And to what extent are we perhaps putting a little bit too much on their shoulders?
Yeah, that's a good question, Kirsten, and I think you answered it in your second half sentence there. It's too much on their shoulders, in my view. As we all know, you know, plants take up carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and they fix it in their biomass. And that's a key process, but this key process has been there ever since plants conquered land. So they exchange, you know, these gases, take up CO2 and give up oxygen in there. And so for many businesses and all of us, I think this seems an easy option. You know, we have more CO2 in the atmosphere. So if we need to take it out of the atmosphere, what's easier than putting more plants into the landscape so that they can sequester it? And we call this, you know, carbon offsets, for example. And many businesses really focus on this, of saying, well, what's easy? We don't need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We just need to have more offsets. And I think there is a lot of evidence right now that this is a dangerous thing to do, because there is just not enough plants that we can plant on the planet to take up all of these gases out of the atmosphere. And so you ask, well, why is this, Stefan? So if we think about the amount of emissions that we're putting out into the atmosphere, that's about 40 billion tons of CO2 every year. And 36 of them come from fossil fuel burning, and about 4 of them come from deforestation. But only about 30% of these are taken up by plants. About 20% or 25% end up in the ocean, and the rest goes into the atmosphere. So it shows us that we are increasing the CO2 emissions into the atmosphere ever more because we're burning more fossil fuels. So if you have this, we're burning more fossil fuels and the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere increases, what's the answer? Plant more plants? No, it wouldn't be the answer because there's just not enough space for it. And you know, our university has recently done some research on this one as part of a big project of Net Zero Australia. So we're looking into what do we have to do in Australia to really, as a nation, have net zero emissions, and across all sectors, transport, energy, and agriculture was part of it. And an answer was to get agriculture net zero, so having our meat and livestock production, our agricultural production, we would have to plant 5 million hectares of new plantings to sequester about 60 million tons of CO2 per year. Okay, that doesn't mean anything to anybody here in the room and online, but let me put this into perspective. So Australia's greenhouse gas emissions are 500 million tons. We will get 60 million tons if we plant 5 million hectares of new forestry plantings. For the last 20 years, Australia only had 2 million hectares of plantations, and this area has actually decreased rather than increased. So it's a huge undertaking to plant 5 million hectares of new forestry plantings in Australia, if 2 is all we had right now. And it only offsets not even all of the emissions that we have from agriculture. So this little sort of brain teaser shows you how difficult it is just to use plants as offsets to deal with the emissions that we're putting out. So the answer really is no. We have to all grab our own noses here and saying, well, what can we do to really reduce the emissions in terms of conserving more energy or becoming more renewable in our everyday actions? And this is not only us as human beings in our own households, but it's all our businesses, of course. And don't rely on the plants. They're not the answer here.
Thanks, Stefan. And I would sort of add an extra layer to that. Even if we could plant 5 million hectares a year of those trees, with changing climates, we have increased risk of fire and flood, and we don't have a guarantee that they would actually make it to maturity and do the job that we're asking them to.
Well, it's a good point, Kirsten. And I think it comes to the fact that we also think, okay, well, we sequester this carbon and it's in a tree. And that's true. It's there. The wood that we stand on here, that's been sequestered. But a tree in a forest, if you think about it, it lives, it grows, it takes up CO2, it puts this CO2 into carbon in the wood, and it's stored there. But this tree is there not indefinitely. And what happens to the tree when it falls over, when a bushfire comes along, or a flood, or a pest and disease, a drought kills the tree? Well, the tree will fall over, it lies on the forest floor. And then what happens? Then Michelle's critters come along, the little fungi that start eating this tree up, and they'll turn it back from carbon into CO2 into the atmosphere. So it's a cycle that we have in all plants, is that they're good at taking up CO2, but once they decompose, we return this sequestered CO2 back into the atmosphere, and we are back to where we started. So it's not an indefinite sequestration that we're having, and this is why we have these safeguards in sort of the climate mitigation speak, is that we're saying, well, we actually want permanence in the sequestration. And with the forest, well, sorry, you don't get permanence, because you get the CO2 sequestered for the time that the forest is there. But you really have to think about, what do we do with this CO2? What happens with the CO2 if the forest is no longer there? And of course, with climate change, we're getting more risks to our ecosystems in terms of increased floods, increased bushfires, increased droughts, and different pests and diseases that might come along and impact these plants. And so there is a real danger for the health of our ecosystems going forward.
That's very controversial.
Hey, controversy.
I guess I wouldn't be so quick to say, let's not rely on the plants. I think that there are some boxes in our cupboard that we could pull out, and the important thing is that we don't say it's the only answer, right? So I can maybe a couple of things maybe to poke your suggestion. I do think we've got this soil storage, right? And there is carbon that is actually sequestered in soil potentially for a very long time. I mean, fossil fuels is actually plant carbon sequestered in soil. Mm-hmm. So it's not all about the respiration coming from litter on the surface that you're describing. So we have ways of thinking about plant design or plant system design to put more carbon into that soil pool, which takes longer to get out into CO2 in the air. So we have a bit of time. We can use plants to maybe buy time. And from a biotechnology point of view, we do have ways of thinking about designing our plants genetically to shift more to this carbon storage function of plants. So plants in existing systems, rather than saying plant more land to more plants, we can take our landscape already to crops or trees and think about, well, what could we do to accelerate, essentially, with breeding or with biotechnology, some traits into those plants to buy us some time.
Can I have a riposte?
Please.
Yeah, soil carbon is a good suggestion because it's also something that, particularly in Australia and only in Australia, always comes up as a solution to climate change. It's saying that we need to store more carbon in the soil. And globally, it's correct. Most of the carbon in the terrestrial biosphere is actually underground in the soil, about 2/3 of it, and only 1/3 is in plant biomass and above ground. So it's true, it's a huge carbon store, but it's also one that's not permanent because you have the same issues that you have with above ground plants, is that soil carbon storage for any given soil has a maximum of carbon that you can store in there, and it sort of changes until you get a new equilibrium of the inputs and the outputs. And the inputs into soil carbon come from plants. It's the only way how you sequester CO2 into the soil is by a plant that fixes it by its leaves through the chloroplast, makes plant biomass, dies, and becomes soil carbon at the end. And then you have all the bugs in the soil that eat up this plant biomass, and part of it will remain in the soil, but eventually it will be respired again. And so you have the inputs and the outputs will match each other. If you have more inputs, you get more soil carbon storage. If you have more outputs or less inputs, then soil carbon storage changes again. So it's never a permanent store, and it depends on, again, your climate, your plants that you put onto the ground, and your environmental conditions, whether you have more rainfall or less rainfall, or more stress or less stress, whether you can actually get soil carbon in there. It's very difficult to measure. It's not easy. You can't just measure it from space. And the changes are very, very small. So it appears a good solution, but in reality, it probably really isn't, Michelle.
I mean, I think what we probably really have to say is that the current models around soil carbon and plant inputs to soil carbon are not actually accounting for anything below 30 centimeters depth. So there is a massive, well, there's essentially a 50% carbon gap in the sort of statements that you're making, Stefan.
All right, a 50% gap, that's quite a big hole. Claire, did you want to
Actually, no opinions on this.
contribute here? Okay.
I'm more on the carbon, adaptation, mitigation, using plants to make our life better rather than worrying about the accounting issues, which I know are big, but I don't have an opinion.
Okay. Sure. Well, perhaps we'll move on to thinking a little bit into the future again, and maybe even a little futuristically to consider what we know now and what we might do with plants in space. Michelle, thoughts here?
Yeah, so I suppose this is designing plants for space. So next decade, so here we are in, this decade. Next decade, they're planning to have humans on Mars. And by the end of this decade, there's going to be a base on the moon, and there's going to be launches to Mars. So this has probably brought plants really back into focus because, as I was mentioning, or we're talking about, plants are the only living or non-living sort of machines or organisms or systems that can take sunlight, convert it into energy, and turn that into a multitude of biochemicals that are used from food to pharmaceuticals. And that means when it comes to colonizing space or going to Mars, we need to grow plants in space. And the distance it's going to take, the distance and time it takes to reach Mars is too long for the actual spacecrafts to carry enough food even for 3 people to arrive on Mars. So about 5 universities in Australia, we've got together and we're putting together an initiative to design the next plant systems for inhabiting space. And I guess the exciting thing about the initiative is the traits that we need for plants in space are exactly the sort of traits that we need for plants on Earth. They need to be highly water use efficient. They need to be able to use nutrients from organic waste directly. They need to have a very high harvest index, so we need to be able to use all parts of the plant for all kinds of different functions that we've been talking about here. And finally, it turns out that the psychological benefits that come from plants for astronauts, which have been documented in space trips, is one of the key features of actually needing plants rather than, say, dry food packaging or pills or supplements. And even if we wanted to say people, why don't we grow vats of yeast or bacteria or something like that for inhabiting space, we would need to feed those organisms plant material. So it's the idea of inhabiting space has brought us back to just thinking about this fundamental capability of plants to essentially meet all of human needs.
Amazing. Claire, did you want to comment on plants in space and how...
Actually, I would, because it just, weren't you all thinking about Matt Damon and how being a botanist saved his life? Really unbelievable, but, probably the coolest part in that movie, really, was him trying to grow potatoes. But, yeah. But, look, I think it's right. I think, whilst that is really way out there compared to the work we do, I think coming back to that trait framework and trying to find ways of understanding how plants work from their characteristics. So not needing to know all the intricacies of how they do everything, but coming back to generalisations we can make about, their leaf area or what they're doing to select plants for use here as well, which is exciting.
Yeah, I guess, because you work on urban systems and the way that we have to grow plants for us living in cities is very much how we will need to grow plants for spaceships and space habitation. So I think also the technologies around the automation and the robotics and the engineering around these ultra-efficient plant systems, those technologies cross over as well. Yeah.
And definitely, in the urban realm, I think it's just bringing those different disciplines together. So, the engineers and the designers and the architects working with people who understand plants. And I think the more of these kind of projects happen, the more you share common knowledge about systems. And with green walls, indoor green walls, you can argue about the sustainability of them, but they do bring people closer to plants in their lives who might not have a yard or even a balcony. There's apartment buildings where the lobby might be their biggest green feature, which is sad, but true. And, you think about the evolution in lighting for those, because they use, the older systems use bucket loads of energy for those light globes so that the plants can grow. And that has jumped so far, in recent years, so that they're cooler and they don't use as much energy.
I might just ask you one more question, Claire, leading on from that about all the amazing things plants do for us in the urban environment. And then after that, I will go to some questions from the audience here and also online. So you all get your thinking caps on, because we'll be coming to you soon. So Claire, what about all the things plants do for us right here in the city?
Yeah, you can actually reverse that question and go, what are our cities like without plants? And they're pretty terrible. They're hot. We have flooding. We have stormwater runoff, degrading streams. We have a lack of biodiversity of all sorts. And we'd be pretty miserable, I think, by not having greenery to look at. So if you then go from that premise and go, well, how do we make it work and how do we get more of it in cities? Then it's about thinking about how we design buildings, how we arrange them in the landscape, together. So it's, building scale, precinct scale, and then city scale to create cities that will have all of those features, absorb the stormwater runoff, increase biodiversity, cool our cities, and maybe help us cope with, the changing climate that we have.
Yes, well, this is one of my key messages when I teach urban ecology, is that we know all those things and all the value that green transpiring vegetation provides to us, particularly in a climate that's becoming hotter and with more extreme heat events. Flooding has also become a little bit front of mind in recent weeks as well. We know how to do it, but we're not doing it. If you look at these new subdivisions in the growth corridors of Melbourne, for example, the northern, western and southeastern growth corridors, you have a look at an aerial photo and it's just a mass of enormous houses with black roofs squashed to the boundaries of the lot, no space for private gardens, very little space for street trees, and then there'll be a little bit of a neighbourhood park. But there's no way that can offset the increase in the local temperature, even leaving aside the problems with the stormwater runoff and where all that water goes and all the pollutants it brings, and then those arrive where the frogs are, and I had to bring frogs in. Yeah. So yeah, we know how to do things much better, but we're not doing it. I find it frustrating. Yes. So how about a question from the audience on one of the topics that we've covered so far? I might start with people in the room and then go to an online question. Thanks. Oh, we've got one just here. That's right, Daryl. And then we can go to the fellow near the front.
I would hope that somewhere among the four of you, you can tell us how we make that happen. How do we get greener areas in these suburban areas that are just so depressing and somewhat frightening when you look at how much concrete is replacing soil and greenery? Where does the change come from?
Well, I think we need to have policy change, and we need much stricter regulations on what happens on private land, and regulation of the ratio of how much of your block of land can be covered with impermeable surface, whether that's your house or your garage or your concrete driveway, because all those things together are just not leaving enough space for living systems, for permeable soil, for transpiring vegetation, as I said. And at the moment, there just don't seem to be those planning controls. So I feel that that's a key point.
State?
That's largely local government, I would say. Both. Stefan?
Yes, I recently attended a conference in Adelaide, and there was a council that had some ideas around this, and so they had aerial imagery where they assessed the amount of canopy cover per private properties. And so they've set targets for each of these properties to say, okay, well, that's the amount of canopy cover that you should have. And if you had less canopy cover, your rates would go up. And they would go up by a fair amount. So this then, on the other hand, would be an incentive for people to increase canopy cover, of course. So you're saying, okay, well, maybe my rates can go down by $300 a year if I have additional greenery in there. And they have implemented this. So yes, I would agree with Kirsten there that it's the local government, it's the council rules around how do you develop our suburbs, and what's happening at the moment on the fringes in Melbourne is not very pretty, particularly because we have all these dark roofs there, which are very energy inefficient. We're building mass houses which are not very energy efficient, and they're allowed to occupy a lot of the land area that's allocated to them without having any dedicated rules around how much plant space or how many plants do you actually have, how many impervious surfaces can you have. And so it's critical that we change these local rules and that we introduce more plants into these areas.
Michelle, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, just stepping back, I think it has to do with exposing more young people during their education and after their education to plants. Plants, I think we almost just take them for granted. So they're not necessarily always, sometimes you might have your teacher, for example, and then you get your pineapple teacher and it's great. But we need to make sure plants are just a central part of our science and biological understanding. And both at the high school and primary and high school, and then university levels, because then people develop a love for plants.
Yeah.
There are also community issues here, and I think especially in the growth suburbs, you can't disentangle the communities and their expectations of owning a house. For many of these people, they come from countries where they would never own a block of land. And so for them to be able to build the house that is as big as they want and has the 3 bathrooms and all of that, that's their biggest dream in their whole entire life. And they might have a lot of their family come live with them as well. So while I totally agree that at a broader level there should be, building envelope sizes and things like this, it is really fraught to sort of build communities and say, well, what vegetation would you like to see in your neighbourhood and your community? So we just don't come and say, you have to plant this tree and you have to have a garden that looks like this, because I think for most of us, we'd be horrified if someone come and told us what we would do in the leafier suburbs of Melbourne, for instance. So I think that social, ecological, community stuff is complicated in that space.
Okay, do we have a question online, Alexa?
So there was a lot of interest on the book you mentioned earlier around Zena Compton and Michael Sean Fletcher and that work and colleagues. So a couple of people online have asked, are there any other recommendations or soon-to-be released publications relating to first knowledges and plants that you might be able to recommend?
Well, I know that book is part of a series on First Nations knowledge related to different topics. If people want to have a taster of some of that work, Zena actually published an Indigenous plant guide when she was working as part of my research hub, the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub. And that's available just as a downloadable PDF booklet, which has information on a range of different plant species, how they were used by Indigenous people for food, for medicine, in cultural ways. And it also includes little plant labels that you can print out and stick in your garden if you'd like to. So after this, I'd be happy to provide the link to that, as well as the link to the more substantive book that's more recently been published. I have another question here.
Thank you. It was really good. I just want to go back to the... Is that on now? Yep. Oh, cool. I just wanted to go back to the debate that we were on earlier about plants and climate change. We looked at it from a sort of CO2 and carbon sequestration angle, but I wondered if you could all talk about how plants can help shape our hydrology and create sort of their own weather systems, and how the mechanisms behind that and how that could help us, say, buffer some of the effects of climate change.
Yeah, well, plants do influence, of course, the hydrology. I mean, we know this because we're trying to protect, for example, the catchments around Melbourne, their own forested areas, so that we're having the drinking water that we're using in Melbourne. And of course, people often talk about that we should, for example, plant more trees so that we can create our own weather systems effectively, because if you have trees, usually you have more leaf area per ground. So as such, if you have more leaf area per ground, you get more evapotranspiration from the tree back into the atmosphere, so you are moistening up the atmosphere. We call this evapotranspirative cooling, and if you have enough trees there, then you would also create more or less your own weather and your own rainfall potentially. The problem is how you go from an unvegetated area that has only about 300 millimeters of rainfall for the most part of Australia to one that creates its own weather and all of a sudden generates, let's say, 600 or 800 millimeters of rainfall, which is the amount of precipitation that you would need to sustain a forest. And I don't think there is evidence that this has ever been done on a large scale, so that you can really change an ecosystem in a way, because where's the initial water going to come from to sustain a forest that will grow and create this amount of effectively evapotranspiration to create new clouds to create its own rainfall. So I'm a bit skeptical that this is something that we can sort of geoengineer our own weather. Michelle? Disagreements?
I'm happy with that. Yeah.
I'd just like to add an idea that perhaps in the urban environment, when we have so much excess water from stormwater runoff, could we possibly try it there on a small scale, divert that stormwater to irrigate our new forest?
Yeah, So who goes first here? Maybe Claire can go first.
But yeah, definitely. And I think that that's something to do, and that's what they're doing out in the western suburbs, where Stefan's right. You know, the annual rainfall in the western suburbs doesn't sustain a forest. It's a sparsely wooded grassland. But by diverting the stormwater into tree pits on verges, so it's a way of getting greenery into suburbs where people might not want trees in their own yards, then you can get a big tree that's going to have a big canopy and cool those cities. And, you know, councils like Melton, they've done a fantastic job. They've actually said that every new street tree going into their suburbs has to be irrigated with stormwater runoff diverted into it, which is pretty amazing.
So we call this technique water-sensitive urban design, and what we're doing is we're taking water that would normally just run off from a street into a stormwater drain and then eventually pollute our rivers, because let's be honest, if you've looked at the Yarra in the last few days, you'll see how much pollution this creates. And so we're using this stormwater, instead of running it into our rivers and polluting our rivers, we're using it to irrigate the street trees on our streets. So this is technology that we're working on here at Burnley together with a number of councils, and we're trialing these. What are the best mechanisms of actually getting this stormwater to the trees? And it sounds much easier than it is, because there are engineering challenges of how you make sure that the irrigation pits are not blocked up, or that they're not having to be maintained all the time, that there is an efficient infiltration and that you're not getting blockages on the treescape. But it's in a very exciting way, I think, of how we can redesign our cities and actually make them more sustainable.
And I guess there's a lot of really interesting plant traits that we need to identify for those systems. So plants, the roots themselves can sense water. And so it's that balance between them being attracted to pipes and water and clogging, right? Problematic, too many roots, to being waterlogged, being able to, so I think from a scientific point of view, there's a lot to discover.
Do we have an online question?
Online one. So Graham Page would like to know, why do we not hear a lot more about beneficial fungi on gardening shows? Fungi seems to be ignored even though it's so important to plant health and vigour.
Ooh, who wants to tackle the fungi question?
ignored on gardening show. Well, I think fungi gets reasonable coverage on gardening shows. Maybe it does now more recently for two reasons. Yes, they perform a whole host of functions for plants and soil, mainly breaking down nutrients from organic forms into inorganic forms, but also stabilizing soil, inhibiting pathogens. And because of pressures to reduce synthetic chemicals, there's actually a lot of activity with companies to develop fungal strains that can be applied with seeds for plants for replacing synthetic chemicals. So, and that's a very, very active area of research now, and very active area for industry, for broadacre agriculture and also horticulture. So yeah, I would agree with the person asking the question. There should be more coverage of it, but I think if they dig in a bit, they'll probably, you can find a lot online now about opportunities for using fungi with roots and soil.
Claire, would you like to comment on mycorrhizae at this point and their value for native plant growth?
I mean, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? Because whenever we do green infrastructure, and we do a lot with engineered soils, and by that I mean they're not just digging up some soil from the ground or using potting mix. We design a soil that has characteristics that will work for it in the different applications. So for an example, a green roof has to be very stable over time, has to have a longevity of say 20 to 50 years, has to be free draining, and it has to be as light as it can be within those constraints. And so they're not made up of organic matter because they break down. And so mycorrhizal in those systems is something that it's not in our immediate mind to think about, but roofs are actually colonised. So we put them out there and the fungi get there and they do their thing with the plants. And I think a lot is the same with the other systems. I think we overthink a lot of stuff and stuff will just happen and sort issues out that we might think is an issue, but it gets resolved. But I think it's a bit like Michelle with studying roots. It's the hidden half, isn't it? And it's just that thing that when we're trying to get everything above the ground to work, we don't necessarily spend equal amount of time worrying about what's happening underneath the soil surface. Oh, great. We've got a lot of questions in the audience. I think the fellow back there had his hand up for a little while. Then we'll go to you next in the room.
Thank you. We had plants that allowed animal life to exist, stromatolites, and next we had man, and humans grew and took over the earth, and we've got to the point, I think it's the first time when we can actually influence things on a global basis, and hence we have climate change and biodiversity loss in very short timescales. So my question is, given that plants can adapt to drought and in wonderful ways, but can they really be expected to adapt to such rapid growth as is being caused by human-induced climate change? And given that the evidence seems to suggest that they can't, or not easily, and that we still depend on plants, don't we really have to take more seriously our obligation to draw back on this pretending that we've got infinite resources and infinite oceans and atmospheres that we can do what we like with? Don't we all have to, whether we want a large house with lots of bathrooms or whatever else, don't we really have to preserve the environment for our sake, but also for the wider environment, and not just continue in a basically a selfish way, and so that plants can have time to adapt, and therefore we can still have this benefit from plants and continue to exist. And
okay, I'll take that one first. So there's a difference between adaptation and adjustments. And that's sort of evolutionary timescales there. Adjustments, that's what plants can do relatively easily. You know, you can have less leaf area, you can grow more roots, or you can grow a bigger plant. So any plant will have these kind of adjustments to changes in their climate over their lifetime. Adaptation means that you actually change the genetic makeup of a plant, and this is, of course, something that takes many, many generations for it to take effect. So you would have to have a large population. This is impacted by climate stress. Only the strongest survive, and those are the ones that are then adapted to the new climate. In long-lived plants, such as trees, this is very, very long time scales that we need to worry about. But you're right, as humans, we actually have the ability to change the composition of ecosystems. And we can make decisions around which type of plants do we want in what ecosystems. And this is easier in some ecosystems than others. You know, in agriculture, we have annual cycles or subannual cycles, so we can put the right genotypes depending on the changing climates that we had. In forest systems, this is much more difficult because we have these long lead-in times, and forest trees will live, really hundreds of years. And so making predictions around what is the right tree species for a future climate is really tricky, because how do you know that a tree cannot adjust to a new climate? And how do you know that it will be impacted by the climate that we will have in 50 years? And what's that going to look like? So these are difficult questions that we're working on at the moment to understand the capacity, sort of the adaptive capacity of plants. And some plants are better at this than others. And so it might be a bit of a non-answer to your very good question, but I think it's just much more difficult, particularly in the forestry sector, than it is in other sectors.
Michelle, would you like to add something?
I mean, I would agree. I think we should be worried. Well, I was agreeing with the person that asked the question.
Not you.
No, I'm just joking. I think we should be worried because the finer detail of how the climate is changing. Let's look at rainfall patterns, for example, is what's important. And it's not drought per se, and it's not necessarily flood per se. It's the periodicity of rainfall events. And these are changing. The number of days and the duration of a rainfall event is changing differently in the northern part of Australia to the southern part, for example. And we know so little about how plants and even animals, organisms respond to non-steady state conditions. And so this is what I think is quite concerning, is the more dynamic and unpredictable and diverse nature of the climate patterns and how quickly they're coming and how little we know about plants in the reality of these dynamic conditions. So I do think it's increasingly concerning, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially for the natural ecosystems. I think for plantings in cities, I think we can cope with those changes, and I think, a lot of our work has shown we have these hypotheses that the most drought-tolerant plant will be the one that comes from the more arid area, or that the rainforest plant will die when we plant it out in the west because it won't cope with the dry conditions and the hostile soils. And I'm constantly surprised. So I have a bit of hope, I suppose, from that, but I do think for natural ecosystems that can't expand their range quick enough to cope with the changing conditions, that's where the biggest issue is.
Well, I think it's in our food. I mean, it is problematic for crops, for horticulture and broadacre crops, and it's been the source of political discontent in different parts of the world. We see that right now with the Russian situation. So it is very broad, and it is a worry. Yeah.
online question, Alexa?
Online. So Sally Mosby has asked if you could talk a little bit more about how plants nurture and enable biodiversity, such as microbes, insects, vertebrates, and further up the chain.
Question for me. Wow. Because plants are the basis of all food webs, they provide food themselves for herbivores, and then the herbivores, the predators, etc. So they're the basis of energy for our whole ecosystem and all the organisms that exist there. And I think in an urban context, we're really now starting to see how important our cities are for biodiversity conservation. And while we might be able to, for example, choose a couple of tree species to provide maximal shading or cooling, those species aren't necessarily going to provide the best biodiversity benefits. So there's some really interesting work we can do to try and maximise benefits for people, but also for other species. And from a frog perspective, we know that plants in water bodies are really important as providing key sites for calling. Many of our frogs, when they breed, they attach their egg masses to plants in the water. They're places to hide from predators as well. And as tadpoles living in an urban pond filled with introduced fish, underwater plants are really important for providing shelter for them. So from that really small sort of let's think about a tadpole in a pond scale to let's think about how we can promote or bring back our native biodiversity into cities by carefully considering our plantings, there's so much we can do. And this is some of Claire's work with the woody meadows is going to be expanding into biodiversity. But yes, I think on lots of different scales, plants are key to supporting our native insects, our pollinators, and the birds that feed on those, and up we go. Any further thoughts?
Maybe it's also, isn't it? We have our preconceived ideas about biodiversity and plants, so there will be people that will say, if you want to improve local diversity, then you need to be only planting plants that existed in Melbourne pre-colonisation. And that is a perspective, and I respect it, but I don't know if I agree with it. And I think that that's the thing that we probably need to be working on a little bit more, is to go, what are the attributes of plants that will support different elements of biodiversity, and how do we select plants that have those characteristics to broaden the range of plants that we plant so that we get those multiple benefits? Because, while a grassland is beautiful and amazing, it's not going to fulfill all of our needs for tree cover and things like that in cities. It's one part of the picture, but it won't ever be the whole one.
Yes, and I'd like to add to that just a little bit, that the structural diversity of plant communities is something that we have lost so much in our quest for neatness in the city. If you look at our parklands, so many of them are sort of based on that model of expansive grasses with occasional trees, and there's not much in between. We're missing the mid-story, we're missing the small shrubs, the spiky little plants where the small birds can hide from the big bossy birds, those little micro habitats that are so important for so many species. And through this quest for neatness, and sometimes it sort of merges into a desire for safety in public spaces, and a sense that, well, if we've got a dense shrub layer, that might be great for the birds, but I can't see who's on the other side of those shrubs, and maybe that's a concern for me. So I think working with designers, landscape architects, and a broader palette. I just love that word.
People and plants.
That's right. The plant palette concept, a broader diversity of plants, I think we can start to solve some of those problems, and maybe we can just have little messy bits here and there. The whole park doesn't have to be messy, but if we can have rocks, logs, leaf litter, spiky things, dense things, floppy things like this, altogether, at least in some areas, we're going to be, just by doing that, providing for so many more plant and animal species than otherwise, plus fungi. Don't forget the fungi. Yeah, perfect. How are we going? I think we have this person in the green shirt. Thank you.
My question is about the oceans and aquatic plants and ecosystems, and what research or potential is there for them to be involved in carbon capture as well?
Yeah. So the ocean in itself is an important body in the carbon cycle because it takes up a large amount of carbon. About 90 million tons of CO2 has been taken up, but also released by the ocean. This is a more passive process where CO2 is gassing in and out of the ocean. There's actually not plants involved. But you would have heard about kelp forests, for example, and using them as major sequestration options. And I think to some degree, there's of course a truth in it because it's a plant, it lives in the water, it takes up CO2, it makes the biomass. It's more a question of the longevity of how much of the kelp, for example, can you grow? And what happens with the kelp once it dies off? Because does it really just go down into the deep, deep ocean, and is the CO2 that's been sequestered in the kelp biomass staying there? Or does that decompose? And I think there we do have some questions around it. But the bulk of the ocean carbon uptake comes from these biophysical processes. They're not plant-based or animal-based. So I don't think there is a great deal that we can manipulate, not forgetting that the bulk of our planet is actually ocean. About 70% of the planet is just ocean surface. And how do we manage this? How do we even get there to have kelp forests that we can manage? That's really, really challenging.
Thoughts, Claire or Michelle? So, Stefan, could you just expand a little bit on the concept of blue carbon? And is this associated with kelp forests, as you're suggesting, or is that to do with algae in the oceans, mangroves in coastal systems, all of the above?
So blue carbon is carbon that is on the fringe between the land mass and the ocean. So this is mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. And these are ecosystems which actually hold a lot of carbon stock. So it's therefore been seen as an important solution potentially for climate change because we have large amount of carbon, particularly in the soil in these ecosystems. But there are questions around this because if you really want to use it for mitigation, you need to have an additionality question. So you need to do something, not just business as usual. So in that sense, you would have to restore an ecosystem like a mangrove system that has been degraded. And if you look at the numbers, there's actually only about, a very small proportion of the mangrove systems that would be eligible for this type of climate change mitigation restoration. And it wouldn't really make a big difference in terms of the carbon uptake or sequestration potential there globally. And of course, the other problem is that a large proportion of the carbon that is in a blue carbon ecosystem doesn't necessarily come from within the system. So it wasn't taken up as CO2 by the plants that live in the system, but it was transported from elsewhere as erosion carbon, for example, and then sedimented there. So it's not a new sequestration. And that's where the mitigation comes in. Yeah? So you still have carbon that's buried, but it's not new carbon that's been taken out of the atmosphere. So from a mitigation point of view, this is really difficult, and we don't really have a good handle on what is the proportion of this sort of outside the system carbon that's been in a blue carbon system, and it varies between 20 and 80%, Michelle. So that's bigger than your 50 that you had in the soil.
You did mention the soils of these systems.
Yeah.
I guess one thing, like the mitigation strategies around plants, it's possible that there's questions, and obviously they're not the solution, the only solution for mitigating against atmospheric carbon, but often they bring other benefits. And I think that's has to be part of the message, especially, let's say, in agricultural broadacre systems that I'm a bit more familiar with. Encouraging growers to adopt carbon sequestration practices is beneficial, because those carbon sequestration or inputting more carbon into soil is associated with greater nutrient turnover, better soil aggregation, less erosion, possibly even water-related, water use efficiency benefits. So, yeah, I think that, you know, it sounds cliche, but it can be a little bit win-win with plants. So it's, yeah, I think there's some benefits that way.
Of course. I love a win-win. Moira.
I've got a question for Claire, I think. So most of us live in urban environments. We're busy. We like plants. We don't really know a lot about them. We're not botanists. We don't really quite know what to do. We probably don't have a huge amount of extra money to spend on them. But we want to feel better. We want the psychological benefits. We want to increase biodiversity. What can we do?
Probably stand next to me in Bunnings. Like, my husband always laughs, like whenever we go to buy, you know, lettuce seedlings or whatever else, you know, yes, and I do shop at Bunnings. I'm always telling the couple next to us or the family who are working out what they're going to grow, and I'm like, don't buy those, go and get a packet of seed instead and just spread them out. So there is a gap in desire and knowledge, I think, with gardening broadly. I suppose that's the other thing. I didn't mention it. I talked about David Attenborough, but I watch Gardening Australia religiously. You know, it was back in the day when you only had 2 channels, so what else were you going to do? And I didn't go out much because I was a good girl. So Gardening Australia was kind of it for me. And, you know, to the point where I joke now that I don't watch it very often because there's only so many times you can be told about compost. But I actually watched it the other week and I was blown away with the stories, actually, and the linking to culture and to mindfulness and just the whole scale that they were talking to. And they were talking to people in apartments and busy people who might have an interest in looking after, you know, a couple of pot plants or a small space, and then those that have the amazing garden. So it's seeking out the knowledge, but I think too, not being too precious and going, it's an experiment, try it. If it doesn't work, you can try something else the next time. Because I know it's really sad when a plant dies, it is. But it is the way to learn as well. You know, you do learn from your mistakes, and gardening is a long journey of mistakes and learning. And I think that applies to our research too. You know, like we go in thinking we know what we're doing and then we'll make some mistakes and we'll go, oh, that's really interesting. Never knew it would work like that. The next one, we don't repeat the mistake and we, you know, modify it. So that's what I would say, is just give it a go. What have you got to lose?
I'd just add that there's now a really strong body of evidence demonstrating the psychological benefits that people gain from interacting with plants, whether it's in their own garden, walking through parks each morning, and that we're becoming much more conscious of that, and I think that's a really important step forward. And I have to say, I got very excited the other day when my beans germinated. I was a bit worried that all this rainfall we'd had, that they wouldn't come up. But Vic can testify. I've got 11 little bean seedlings now. So veggie patch is underway for the spring. Someone's waving, and then perhaps we'll go to an online question. Thanks.
Hi. Thank you, first of all. Quick question about space-related things like closed systems, whether they're on a spaceship or a extraterrestrial sort of colony or whatever the case is. I mean, they're not strictly closed, I guess, because you are harvesting it, but what role do things like bacteria, fungi, and perhaps insects play in these little things? It's not just plants alone, I'm guessing. It needs to be some sort of a system that interacts.
Yeah, really good question. So we're grappling with this right now because, of course, the default position is thinking, well, they should be sterile, right? So initially minimize potential for pathogens and microorganisms. Growing, because it's such a closed system that they grow out of control, and then it's ultimately sort of the plant that needs to live. So in short, we actually don't have an answer. And in vertical farming systems, it's actually microorganism interactions that can cause the problems for the plants. So there's a lot that we need to learn about actually, I guess, designing or knowing what's the minimal microbiome, essentially, that's needed for closed systems. So that's not very satisfying. But for the insects, I think that's an interesting one because we probably can't expect to have pollinators. I'm talking about space now. And so there we are really thinking about how the plants that don't require insect pollinators for pollination, and we're also thinking about things that, how plants actually regenerate without flowering. So we're having to go back through the entire diversity and history of plants that we have knowledge of and think, okay, we might actually need a non-flowering trait to combine with, quite a advanced recent trait that might be, for another function that we need in that plant. Because we would like to be able to have what NASA calls pick and eat plants, where you pick them continuously. It's not like farming that we know about on Earth, where you pick everything at one point, because that's all designed around mechanization and harvesters. We want to have plants that continuously regenerate so that we can pick and eat them, and then we don't necessarily have to plant them or rely on pollinators very often.
Great. Well, I might just go to one more online question before I come back to my panel with a last question for you all.
Yeah, so coming back to Earth, and more specifically Melbourne CBD, would removing deciduous trees in Melbourne CBD and replacing them with evergreen trees be more beneficial to the environment? There is so much leaf litter, pollen dust, green waste, and waterways must be overflowing with the waste. That's from Jack Hamilton.
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I mean, what the city of Melbourne is doing is that they are actually replacing a number of their plane trees in the city, but not because they're deciduous, but mainly because they want to have a greater diversity of tree species in the city composition. So city of Melbourne has about 365 different tree species growing in the city of Melbourne area. So this is a lot of different tree species, but of course, if you look at the abundance of each species, there's a difference there. So you have some species which have a much greater number of them, and in the CBD in particular, we have a lot of plane trees there. So personally, big lover of plane trees, I admit it. They are, for me, almost a perfect street tree. They're lovely, they give you shade when you need it, and yeah, they have a bit of nasties that some people get a bit of an allergic reaction to, but otherwise they're really great. But there is a desire to get more diversity into the city so that you spread your risk, if you will, because there is a potential that there could be a specific pest or disease or certain climatic conditions that the plane trees are no longer accustomed to, and so once this happens, then you have really spread your risk because you have lots of different species there. But no, I'm more of a fan of having a diverse urban forest in general. So this includes evergreen and deciduous trees. And think about, from a winter's perspective, when it's very dark anyway, there's actually benefit of having deciduous plants in the city or around you, because it means you get more light into your house. If you have an evergreen tree there, well, that always has leaves in there. And in winter, when it's dark already, then you get more shade when you actually don't really need it. You actually want the light in the house. And so deciduous trees have their benefits then as well.
I was just going to add the light thing, because I think that's really critical in Melbourne, and it's the reason why Melbourne differs from Sydney. You know, we've had students that say to us, you know, Sydney, it's all about shade and having big shade structures over playgrounds so that, you know, little kids can play and not get sunburnt. But in Melbourne, we actually crave that winter sun, so it's a difference, and it's something that is important.
Great. Well, thanks everyone for such a wonderful conversation. And my final question to you all, and I'll start with Claire, is what is one thing that people in the audience here in person and online can do to help plants help save the world?
Thanks, Kirsten. I think, inspired by Moira's question, I would say stop and smell the roses. And the reason I say that is that we all respect and value things that we know a little bit about. So if we take the time to look at the plants that are growing around our neighbourhood, to look at how they change seasonally, when they flower, you know, whether they have little babies coming up and things like that, then we build a relationship with them, and then we have a bit more of attachment, and it's through that we will improve the future, I believe.
Stefan.
If you want to save the planet, eat plants. There's scientific evidence for this. So half of the inhabitable space on Earth is agriculture. But 80% or 77% of the agricultural space that we're using to grow animals or animal feed. So there's livestock, dairy, and the feed for the livestock and dairy or meat that we're eating there. But this 77% of the land mass only provides about 20% of the calories that we're eating. So we're getting 80% of the calories that we're requiring from 23% of our land mass. So if you really want to make a difference in terms of the emissions that are associated with growing the food, mainly meat, well, stop eating it. There you have it.
All right. That's the first round of applause.
Yeah.
Michelle.
Yeah, that's going to be tough to beat, Stefan. I guess I would say plant to plant. So just, I never stress when my plants die, because they're just part of this cycle of our resources in life. And animals, I think, are a little more stressful. Kids, obviously, more so. But the great thing about plants is they're so forgiving. They're so resilient, but they're so delicate and they're so beautiful. So I would just plant to plant. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you all. So I've been given the job of summarising the wisdom from tonight's discussion, and it's a little tricky across all the topics, but I'd just say how wonderful it was to hear from you all on all these various things that plants do. They do amazing things, and we can engage with them by smelling the roses, planting a plant, eating the plants, all those things, breathing the oxygen and saying, thank you, plant, that we can breathe this atmosphere. And I think slowing down and taking the time to remember what they do for us is a really important step for everybody, considering the value of plants in our lives and how we can help them help us and all the other species into the future. So thank you very much, Dr. Claire Farrell, Professor Stefan Arndt and Professor Michelle Watts. Thank you all.